All right, guys, these are how many time management techniques that I've tried, and these are how many really made a difference in my life. Many of them work, but these 6 are the top 6, and we're gonna go over those today. Hey guys, my name is Michael Thompson. I'm a youth pastor and a student. On this channel, we discuss personal and professional development from a Christian perspective, and I've used these 6 techniques over the years to be able to stay in school full-time, also have a full-time job, and 3 years ago, I got married, and all these principles have made a big difference. So here's the first one, the Eisenhower matrix. President Eisenhower discussed this principle that there's 4 different quadrants all tasks fit into. The first quadrant is the urgent and important. Now this includes tasks like responding to the angry client email or doing something that is due today that you may have forgot about. Maybe a deadline that you should have been working on, you procrastinated on, and now it has to be done today. So this is the urgent and important. These things have to be done right now. The second category is the important but not urgent. Now this is preparing a presentation that's due next week or going back to school for more training in your field. Nobody's telling you this has to be done next week or the week after. Obviously assignments, yeah, but like the degree overall, that's not something that has to be done by this date most of the time. But it is something that you're working on that's important, but doesn't have to be done right away. And a little bit of a sneak peek is that this is where all the most effective people spend their time, in that second quadrant. The third quadrant is the urgent but not important. Now this is responding to non-essential emails or messages and answering phone calls that are spam calls, okay? You don't want to spend a lot of time in that third quadrant. And then the fourth quadrant is the urgent and not important. So this is like your phone giving you notifications for ESPN that does not make a difference in your job or how productive you are in the day in a positive way. It's very negative, okay? It's distracting, and these urgent and not important tasks are where a lot of people spend most of their time. Scrolling social media is another urgent but not important task. You'll get a notification, and before you know it, you've wasted a whole bunch of time, and the actually scrolling didn't help you get things done during the day. Those who are the best at prioritizing their time, they spend most of their day working on the second quadrant, important things that aren't necessarily urgent. Nobody's behind you saying, hey, you have to have this done by this date, but it is a task that whether it furthers your career capital, maybe it's a skill set or a degree that you're not being forced to do, but it does improve your skills. Maybe it's a project that isn't necessarily due this month, it's due 3 months from now. But what happens when you're working on important things way ahead of time, you're able to be much more creative. Now, some people say I have to procrastinate in order to be creative, and that's actually not correct. People who procrastinate and they allow the deadline to make them work on a task, they're always limited by the deadline. And you don't want to get dependent on someone else's deadline making you work on things. You want to be able to be a self-starter, because when you're a self-starter, you're able to start way ahead of time and really finish the project 2 months early. And you say, okay, yeah, you can move on to the next project, or you can sit and soak and make that project far better because you have all this extra time. So spend your time in the second quadrant. That's where the most effective people spend their time. And if you take the time to put all your tasks into these quadrants, that's a great exercise. Sit down and say, here's quadrant number 1, here's quadrant number 2, number 3, and number 4, and then write down everything you do during the week and organize those things into the different categories. And if you do that, you'll be able to really identify where should you be spending your time. Then on Monday morning, when you're the most effective, you spend Monday morning doing that quadrant 2 type of task. And that'll make you far better at prioritizing. That's the big deal in time management, is you're just prioritizing much more effectively. The second time management principle is eat the frog. Now this comes from a saying by a guy named Mark Twain. You've probably heard of him. He said, eat a live frog first thing in the morning, and nothing worse will happen to you the rest of the day. Now, I'll be honest with you, I haven't really eaten a live frog to see if he was correct. I'm gonna go ahead and take his word for it. But the frog, in his statement, it represents the biggest, the most important, the most dreaded task that you have to do during the day, and the one you're most likely to procrastinate on. A lot of people in sales, cold calling is one of those tasks. And people say like you're not really supposed to cold call first thing in the morning, but you get the point. It's the hardest thing that you have to do. And if you begin each day with this task, the rest of the day, it feels way easier. A common thing to do right now is the cold plunge, and the psychology behind that, there's people that are huge believers in the cold plunge. I don't do them, but I've heard some people say that when you do something that difficult first thing in the morning, everything else is so much easier. So if you discipline yourself to do the hardest task in your work, again, the rest of the day is going to be easy compared to that difficult task. And this is also a method to fight against procrastination. The most likely thing that you're going to procrastinate on, do it first. And then another thing that I've noticed whenever I do the hardest thing first in the day, there's a lot of momentum that comes from that. I look back on my days that I start out, for me it's writing. If I start out my day writing and I start on time and I start at the beginning of the day, I eat the frog, I notice things just seem to get done so much quicker the rest of the day. And I don't really have the science to prove that, but take it for what it's worth. Do the hardest thing first, eat the frog. That's the second principle. The third time management tip is the Pomodoro technique. Now, this is where you work in intervals of time. So you work, the Pomodoro method says that you use 25-minute intervals, and then you take a 5-minute break in between each one of those 25-minute segments. And on the third break, you take a 15-minute break instead of just 5 minutes. And this principle keeps you working on things, and for me it's really helpful because it gives me a way to measure things that are otherwise really difficult to measure. Let me give you an example. If I have to study for a test that's due in 3 weeks, it's pretty difficult for me to sit down and study just for 30 minutes and then just be done. But what the Pomodoro technique allows me to do is say my goal is 10 sessions for this test, and then I do 20-minute intervals, but you can also do 25. I do 20-minute intervals and I say that I want to do 10 of these, and then it lets me measure leading up to the test, how prepared do I feel? Because if you're like me, you've probably studied for a test before or worked on a project and you thought you were making good progress only to come 2 or 3 days before it's due and realize you should be far more ahead than you actually are. So between the time I start my study process and the actual test, I'm going to have a checkpoint and say, how do I feel? If I keep following this process, am I going to be ready for the test? Am I not? And this gives me just a way to measure when it comes to studying. But there's something also special about having a timer that's counting down whenever you start working on projects. Sometimes our brains, we feel like, I don't know when I'm going to get done with this thing, and so I don't even want to start. But when you know you only have to work on it for 20 minutes, then no matter how hard the task is, and your brain goes, oh, well, it's 20 minutes. It's not that hard. There were times where I did different intervals of different amounts of time. Sometimes in my bachelor's degree, my classes weren't as long, so I would do 10-minute intervals and I would try to fit them in between my classes. Whatever the amount of time is that you focus for, have the intervals and then set a goal on the projects for how many times that you're going to sit down and actually study for that amount of time or work on the project for that long. So that principle, the Pomodoro technique, is very helpful. People will actually go back and forth, and some people say that 25 minutes is too short because you can't get into a flow state because it takes 17 minutes to get to your most focused point whenever you're working on a project. But then other people will say, oh, 25 minutes is actually too long. Whatever you end up doing, work in intervals and have a way to measure that. To me, that's the biggest key to the Pomodoro technique. The fourth principle is the Pareto principle. Now, you have heard of this before, but maybe not necessarily the fancy name. This is also called the 80-20 rule. For a business, this would mean that 80% of the sales come from 20% of the customers. And I work in a church, and so in ministry, often 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And this same thing applies in time management because 20% of your tasks contribute to the 80% effectiveness in your job. So if you're in a job that involves people that are under you or you're managing, then being able to communicate with them well is 20%. And actually doing certain tasks or certain receipts or certain other areas of your job, that may seem very important, but it's not really in that 20%. And it's a great exercise to list the things, kind of like earlier I said, list the things that you have to do during the week and then put them in those categories, like for the Eisenhower matrix. It's also very helpful to list the things you do during the week and say, what's the 20% and then what's the 80%? Because if we're being honest, there are some things in your field and in your work, what you do during the week, that provide far more value than others. And when you know those things, now you're able to prioritize them and put more time towards them. So if you're a teacher in an academic world, then you need to publish peer-reviewed papers. And grading the projects for your students, though it's important and you have to keep your job, or you have to do this to keep your job, that 20% of actually publishing those papers is what's going to move you forward. So have clarity, know which things are the most important. And something else you'll notice is the highest performers in every single field, they know what that 20% is. And there were times before when I was working with some people, I was like, why do they not care about this? Or why do they not want to get this done at a certain point? And then as I got more experience, I realized, oh, that's because this really doesn't move the needle. It's because it's not the most important thing. And that's one of the benefits of having experience in a job is you know what the most important things are and you're able to prioritize them. So the Pareto principle, 80-20 rule, make sure that you know what those 20% of things are and prioritize those during the week. The fifth principle is Parkinson's law. Now this isn't shaky hand syndrome. I actually thought that's what it was when I first read about it. But this law says that work always expands to the time that you give it. And I've seen this in work with certain meetings. If you don't have an end time for the meeting will go on into eternity, sometimes it feels like. Or if you're somebody who has a certain amount of reading that you have to do during the week, whether it's for work or whatever, you'll notice that if you have a deadline that you're coming up towards and you're kind of rushing, somehow things always seem to get done by that deadline. And people who procrastinate, usually they rely really heavily on this principle because they use that deadline and they say, there's no way that I'd be able to get this 10-hour project done in 5 hours, but they start 5 hours before midnight and somehow they get it done. Okay, that's the Pareto principle in action. If you've ever gotten started on a project way ahead of time and then noticed that it just seemed to really drag, again, Pareto principle. So I used this principle to finish off different books because I knew that if I said, okay, here's the deadline and I don't know how I'm gonna get it done, but I'm just gonna get it done, the Pareto principle jumped into effect because work tended to shrink to the time that I gave it. And personally, you can really use this in your life by setting not real deadlines, okay? So they're called artificial deadlines. If you have some type of project that needs to be done in a month, set yourself an artificial deadline for 2 weeks and say, I need to have this done in 2 weeks. And you'll notice that somehow things magically seem to get done. This is also why time management is so important in the form of time blocking, because you'll notice, again, whenever you are saying that I need this to take 1 hour, it tends to take 1 hour. And then if you say, I'm gonna give this 8 hours or whatever. So know that and make sure that you're setting deadlines for all the different tasks that you do. That way you're abiding by Parkinson's law and you set those artificial deadlines and you're able to be successful in the different projects. The sixth principle is task batching. This is the last one we'll talk about today, but this is where you group similar tasks and errands and you do them all at the same time. So instead of saying, somebody needs something from me and they emailed me about it and I'm gonna do it right away, even though right now is the time I'm supposed to be writing and I'm supposed to be working on this larger project. Instead of doing that task right away, you batch it and you do it later in the week. Now, if your boss tells you to do something, you do it right away. That's not really what I'm talking about. But if you have like personal errands to run or returns to make or just tasks that take 5 to 10 minutes, it's really good to batch all those at the same time. Now for me, Friday afternoons is a great time for me to do this, but I ran into this issue where I was trying to not procrastinate. So anytime I had a task to do, I did it right away. And that was good because I wasn't procrastinating, but it was bad because I wasn't necessarily following the plan that I made for my week. I was letting everybody else or even my own brain, the tasks that I remembered I needed to do, I was letting when I remembered those tasks dictate the way that I did my week, rather than here's the most important things in my job and letting those most important things take priority. I was just doing things when I remembered that I had to do them. And this is a huge problem because it wastes the time of starting and stopping. When you work on a task, it takes about 17 minutes to get going. And sometimes we forget about that. Or whenever you're gonna switch tasks, it takes about 17 minutes to switch. And if you do little things throughout the day, just whenever you're prompted, you don't realize it, but you're constantly pulling 17-minute chunks out of your day. And then you wonder why you're not able to have, this project completed or whatever you're working on. Well, it's because you're not staying focused. So another thing that you can do, when you get ideas, this has helped me before, I would keep like a note card at the side of my desk, and now I just do it digitally. I use the Google Keep, yeah. Now I use Google Keep, but you just write down the things that you have to do later in the day while you're working on your project. So you have, your document open that you're writing, and then if you get the idea, oh, I have to do this thing, instead of doing it, write it down. And then when you finish your writing session, you just go and you put all those things you wrote down into a calendar to be done at a later time. And you batch them, do them all at the same time. That way you don't waste the time starting and stopping and getting distracted. Eisenhower matrix, eat the frog, Pomodoro technique, Parkinson's law, task batching. That's a lot to remember. How are you supposed to do all these things? Okay, you're not. Don't do them all at the same time. Whenever you write down what you're gonna do in the week, knowing these principles helps you to best prioritize. So you don't necessarily have to memorize every single one of these things, but it is helpful to take one principle and try it this week. And if you like it, do it again. And what is really cool is eventually it becomes muscle memory. You may not know that you're doing the Parkinson's law or the task batching, but you just naturally, when you're planning your week, you do those things. And then you don't have to make the decision of what to work on next because your week's already planned, and you use these principles on Friday when you plan the next week. So pick a principle, work on it this week, pick another one, work on it next week, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Until next time.